In this video, we're going to be looking at the project folders for our React Native and Redux application. Now, setting up project folders isn't exactly the fanciest thing or the most complicated thing, but I thought it was worthwhile, especially since when I personally have looked at a lot of Redux-based applications, it's taken me a little bit of time to sort of understand how things are organized. So I figured it might be helpful to talk a little bit about Redux, Flux, unidirectional data flow. These are terms that people like to throw around a lot, and I don't think I could do the material justice without explaining sort of my understanding of the whole thing. So if you already know what these concepts are, this video is probably going to be pretty boring and you might want to just skip over it. Anyways, a couple things, just recap. We've got React Native running, we've managed to import some packages. So I thought let's talk a little bit about what is Redux and what is the Redux pattern. So the most interesting thing about this diagram is not the boxes but the arrows. And we've already talked a little bit about the green box, which is the components. These are React components, simple JavaScript classes or functions that basically describe a series of components for a view. Then we've got actions, and these actions are, again, they're just simple functions that describe an activity or something of the sort. For example, set searched recipes, or set the app state to active, or upvote, if I was building some sort of social networking thing. The idea here is that these are actions that will mutate or that will ultimately transform the state of the application. And these are centralized. So any component can trigger an action, but the components, once they send the action, they no longer have any kind of responsibility for the resulting data. And this is significant because the components are purely on the listening end of any data transformations. Now, in the typical Flux pattern, you have this concept of a store. Now, what Dan Abramov has put forward in the Redux pattern is to, rather than consider your data as stored somewhere, think of it as something that is going to change over time. And it's not a place, but an event. And so in that sense, you're actually not looking at your state as something that is persistent or is sitting around for you to access like a bucket in a well. It's something that is evolving from one state to the next state to the next state to the next state. And in functional programming, this kind of transformation can be summed up as a reducer or doing a reduction, which is essentially a transformation of data. And those reductions or reducers can be described as simple functions. So in our application, we are going to describe certain components as being container components. And these container components are like any other component, except they are quote-unquote higher order components. And that fancy name means that they will be connected to Redux and the Redux library. Redux has some secret sauce that enables it to essentially push out props, property changes, to the container components. This will also give us access to the actions that are available to us in our application. So we are going to have a folder with a bunch of actions JavaScript files, and we're going to have a folder with a bunch of reducers. Now, in our particular example, it's a very, very simple application. And if I was just building an application for searching recipes, I probably wouldn't put in all of this architecture because it's quite a bit. You'll also notice here that I have the server and the purple arrow that connects the server to the actions. This is the only arrow that kind of goes both ways. And the idea here is that you want to localize any kind of asynchronous activity to the actions portion of your architecture. What this means is that everything else in the Redux pattern or in the Flux pattern is going to happen synchronously. So you know that when an action is triggered, it's going to modify the store, and there's going to be no asynchronous code anywhere else in your application. This keeps it relatively straightforward to debug things like timing issues or any kind of bidirectional dependencies that might emerge from having to deal with, say, a validation failure or what have you. In our particular example, we are going to be implementing a container component called home, which will be the entry point or the main landing page of our application. We are going to create a method called fetch recipes, which will trigger an action called set searched recipes after it's hit the Spoonacular API. And the set searched recipes will have an action type of set searched recipes, all in title or in uppercase with underscores, which will do a transformation to the recipe reducer. And because home is a container component, the searched recipes props will be automatically updated when the reducer is modified, and home will get these new props and be able to render an updated version of the view. So again, all the asynchronous activity is happening in the actions, and everything else in the application is happening unidirectionally, which means that we can ensure that home will behave predictably and that all of the actions or all of the UI activity will happen in a proper sequence. So let's get this started. I'm going to be adding a few extra libraries to our application. And I'm also going to bring in some stuff that I found personally useful from other projects. So I'm just going to open my folder here. And you'll notice that there's an iOS folder, there's a Node Modules folder. I'm going to create a new folder called App. And this is where my application is going to live. And in here, I'm going to create a folder called Lib. And I'm also going to create a folder called Components, a folder called Containers, a folder called Reducers, and a folder called Actions. So we talked a little bit about actions, we talked a little bit about components, we talked a little bit about container components. The lib folder is where I'm going to keep general purpose, useful JavaScript functions that I have used in several projects. And I'm going to copy two files over, and I'll just talk about them very briefly. One is api.js, and the other one is this createReducer.js. And I'll just quickly open them so you can understand why I might want these things lying around. The api.js file is essentially a simple class that I've written that has some headers, including a key, an API key, which once this gets published, of course, will change, and a few other headers that are necessary to tell the server that I want to speak JSON as my data format. There is a static XHR method here with a fetch. So this is just a very simple JSON fetch, and it's all wrapped up with some helper methods. So we've got get, put, post, and delete. And this allows you to do things like api.get or api.put or api.post or api.delete. Of course, in this example, we're just using api.get, but I found this to be particularly useful, and this is not the kind of code you want to write over and over and over again. So that's file number one. The other file, createReducer.js, is just a very simple function that actually returns another function. And I've found this to be a helpful 6 lines or 10 lines of code for handling the creation of a reducer. And so what this function will do is you pass in an initial state and then a series of handlers. Those handlers are the different action types that you are listening for. And it creates a reducer function which will basically call that action type for that state and that action. Now, this code is fairly abstract, but basically what it does is it means that you don't have to write a switch statement every single time you want to create a reducer. If you look at a lot of Redux examples, they typically end up with a simple to-do list and reducers with a bunch of switch statements. And I personally can't stand switch statements. So I've written this very, very simple function for handling that and for essentially calling this line 4, which looks for this action type and passes in the state in the action and then calls that function. Now let's try and set some stuff up. As I mentioned before in the presentation, we're going to have to define some action types. And in our particular example, we are just going to have one, which we will put in app actions types.js. And it's going to be export const set searched recipes, set searched recipes. This is just a constant that we're going to be relying on as an action in our application. So far, so good. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an index file for actions. And the index file for the actions is going to be very simple as well. It's just going to export a constant called action creators. I'm going to use the object.assign, which allows me to combine multiple objects together. And I'm going to create something called recipe actions here and just close that off with a semicolon. Of course, we need to describe what recipe actions is. And I'm going to put that in another file called recipes. So this might be a bit confusing, so I'm just going to take a moment to try and explain myself. Basically, all of my recipe actions, if I was to have many, so the goal here is to ultimately create an application where I can star certain recipes or keep track of them in some way or another. Those actions, to star, to unstar, to set searched recipes, all of these actions are going to be functions that I will describe in this recipes.js file. And so by using this syntax, I'm basically importing all of them as an object, and then I'm merging them with any other actions I might have in my application, and then returning that as action creators. So basically, I'm just grouping up all of the potential actions that my application could perform into this action creators constant. This is particularly useful as your application begins to grow. For example, you might want to have a way of tracking when you're in the active or the inactive state, when your application goes into the background on the mobile device, or if you want to see if somebody has initiated a search across multiple user interface panes, or for example, when the navigation of your application changes and someone presses on one of the tabs at the bottom of the interface. So all of these things are going to be different actions that your mobile application is going to need to respond to, and it's helpful to have a manifest file that describes them all. And that's why I've gone through the extra legwork of having a bit of indirection here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a file here, which is of course recipes.js. And for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to leave this empty for now, because I don't actually need anything here yet. I just want to get the armature or the skeleton in place. So that's all that for the skeleton for the actions. Let's do the same thing for the reducers. So in the same way that I had an index.javascript or index.js for the actions, I'm going to do the same thing for the reducers. And we're going to be using a method that comes with Redux called combine reducers, which does what you would think combine reducers might do, which is it basically takes a bunch of different reducers and combines them into one. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import everything from the recipes reducer, which is going to be here. So it's the same concept. I could have a number of different recipes reducers, and this is going to combine them all together. And then I can export a default, which will be combine reducers. And again, I'm going to use the object.assign syntax, and I'm just going to add the recipes reducer. Okay, that was a lot of typing. There's a pattern here. The idea here is that we're basically creating a mechanism for adding different reducers and different actions in our application. Now, I talked about just having one reducer for recipes, which was to set searched recipes. However, it could be very likely that I would want to have different portions of my state managed, and each one of those portions of state would be managed as a different reducer. So for example, I could have one reducer for searched recipes, I could have another reducer for starred recipes, I could have another reducer for the currently viewed recipe. And so we're taking different bits of state data and we're storing them in different reducers. And I think this is a fundamental differentiation between an MVC pattern, where you have a model and you might have a bunch of different functions on that model and state, to one where you are transforming your data and you are putting it in different portions of your state. So you might have the same object in different reducers, but representing different aspects of your state. To complete this example, we are going to follow the pattern to its completion, and we'll just do app reducers recipes.js and create an empty file there too. So by the end of this, if we look at our folder structure, we will have 3 files in the actions. We will have one with set searched recipes, one with recipes.js, and one with index.js. And then in reducers, we will have 2 files. We will have index.js, and we will have recipes.js, and that also will be empty. And then in the lib folder, we'll have api.js and create reducer.js. Now, so far we haven't actually invoked any of this code. Now, if I go back to my simulator and I refresh again, nothing should change. In the next video, we're actually going to hook all of this up to that root component that we described in that first video. Thanks for listening.